The air in the department store was thick and warm, smelling of expensive perfume and new leather. It was a place of quiet whispers and the soft rustle of shopping bags. People moved slowly, their footsteps muffled by a deep, plush carpet that soaked up all the harsh noises of the world. They browsed through racks of crisp, colorful clothes and glanced at glittering glass cases, their faces lit by the bright, white lights from above. In the very center of this large open space stood a grand piano. It was a giant, beautiful thing, its black wood polished to such a high shine that it reflected the lights like a still, dark lake. It was more than just an instrument. It was a symbol of the store's elegance, a piece of art placed right in the middle of everything. On the piano bench sat a man. He was a pianist, hired by the store to provide a lovely background atmosphere. He was well dressed, his fingers, long and practiced, resting on the keys. His name was Arthur, and he had been playing piano for most of his life. For him, this was a job. He played the notes correctly, his hands moving from memory through a gentle classical piece by Chopin. The music was pretty, a familiar and safe sound that floated through the air. But to most people, it was just part of the store's furniture, like the nice carpet or the soft lighting. They heard it, but they didn't really listen. Across the room, a young boy was listening. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with bright, curious eyes that took in everything around him. He was there with his mother, who was carefully looking at some clothes a few steps away. The boy, however, wasn't interested in the clothes. He had been drawn to the piano from the moment they walked in. His name was Leo. While his mother browsed, he stood perfectly still, his head tilted to the side. He wasn't just hearing the music. He was feeling it. He could feel the low, rumbling notes in his chest and the high, tinkling ones at the top of his head. His own small fingers, resting at his sides, twitched and made little shapes as if they were pressing down on invisible keys. He watched the pianist's hands, how they flowed across the keyboard, how they pressed some keys hard and others softly, how they seemed to dance. His mother noticed he was gone and looked over. She saw him standing there, completely captivated. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. She had seen this before. She went back to looking at the clothes, but she kept one eye on her son, letting him have his moment. The piece of music came to an end. The pianist Arthur let the last note hang in the air until it faded into nothing. There was a smattering of polite applause from a few people sitting nearby. Arthur gave a small professional nod of his head, a silent thank you to an audience that wasn't really paying attention. He reached for a glass of water on a small table next to the piano bench and took a slow sip. This was his short break, a moment to rest his hands before starting the next piece. It was in this quiet pause that the boy saw his chance. He moved away from his mother and walked towards the grand piano. He wasn't running or being loud. He walked with a quiet purpose, his small shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He came to a stop right beside the shiny black instrument which seemed to tower over him. He had to look up at the man on the bench. He waited for a second, gathering his courage. Then he reached out a small hand and gently tugged on the sleeve of the man's jacket. Arthur looked down, a little surprised. He saw a young boy looking up at him with wide, serious eyes. He felt a flicker of mild annoyance. Children sometimes wanted to bang on the keys, and he had to gently shoo them away. It was an interruption to his routine. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice soft but clear. "Can I play?" Arthur gave him the kind of smile adults give to children when they are being cute, but inconvenient. He assumed, like always, that this was just a simple curiosity. The boy probably just wanted to make some noise. He glanced around and saw a woman, the boy's mother, watching them. She looked a little nervous, but she also had a strange look of confidence on her face. This made Arthur pause for a second. He decided to be polite. "Just for a minute, son," Arthur said, his voice kind but condescending. He gestured towards the massive keyboard. "You can try it out, but be very careful, all right? It's a very expensive instrument." He shifted over on the long bench, making a small space for the boy. He expected the child to climb up and immediately slam his palms down on the keys with a loud crashing sound. He was ready to stop him after a few seconds. The boy, Leo, didn't need to be told twice. He used his arms to hoist himself up onto the bench. The bench was so high that his legs dangled off the edge, his feet swinging well above the pedals on the floor. He sat there for a moment, looking at the sea of black and white keys in front of him. It looked like a complicated puzzle. Arthur watched, waiting for the noise to start. But Leo didn't look like a child about to make a mess. He looked like a musician preparing to perform. He took a slow, deep breath, not a nervous gulp, but a calm, focused breath. He straightened his back and lifted his small hands. Then he placed them gently on the cool, smooth ivory keys. His dark skin stood out in a beautiful, powerful contrast against the pale white of the keys. The pianist, Arthur, took a small half-step back. He was still ready to lean forward and gently pull the boy's hands away at the first sign of a chaotic bang. The first note came. It was a single, tentative sound. Then another. They were simple, but they were not random. They were the beginning of a melody. Leo's eyes fluttered closed for a second, as if he was listening to a song inside his own head. His brow furrowed in concentration, and then something changed. The tentative notes melted away and a new sound began to pour out of the piano. It wasn't the classical music Arthur had been playing. This was something completely different. It was a rich, soulful melody full of feeling. It had the deep roots of gospel music and the clever, unexpected twists of jazz. It was a song that seemed to tell a story without any words. Leo's small hands, which moments before had seemed too tiny for such a large instrument, suddenly came alive. They danced. They flew across the keyboard with a speed and confidence that was astonishing. His left hand laid down a complex walking rhythm, while his right hand spun a beautiful crying melody over the top. He wasn't just pressing keys. He was playing. He understood how to make the music soft and gentle, then loud and powerful. He knew how to pause for just a beat to make the next note even more meaningful. The look on Arthur's face began to change. The polite, slightly bored expression he always wore completely vanished. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. His jaw went slack and his mouth opened just a little. He was a professional musician. He had studied for years. He knew better than anyone in that store just how difficult it was to play with such skill and feeling. This wasn't a child making noise. This was a prodigy. This was real, raw, unbelievable talent. He wasn't the only one who noticed. The gentle background noise of the store, the whispers, the footsteps, the rustling bags, it all began to fade away. One by one, shoppers stopped what they were doing. A woman holding a dress forgot about the dress. A man looking at watches turned away from the glass case. They all turned their heads towards the piano. They saw the small boy, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm his own hands were creating. They saw the look of utter shock on the face of the real pianist standing behind him, and they heard the music, a music that was so full of life and emotion that it commanded attention. A small crowd began to gather, forming a loose circle around the piano. No one spoke. They just watched and listened, their faces filled with wonder. A few people pulled out their mobile phones, quietly starting to record the incredible scene. They knew they were seeing something special, something they would want to remember. The boy's mother watched, her hand covering her mouth. But it wasn't a hand of shock. It was a hand of overwhelming pride. Tears welled in her eyes, but she was smiling. She had heard her son play before, of course, on the small keyboard they had at home, but she had never seen him like this in front of a real piano, in front of a crowd pouring his entire heart out through his fingertips. She knew about his gift, and now the whole world in that department store was getting a glimpse of it. The store was now completely silent, save for the beautiful, complex, and joyful music coming from the grand piano. The little boy was no longer just a boy asking a question. He had become a musician, and for those few minutes he held the entire store in the palm of his small, gifted hands. The final gentle note of the Chopin piece faded away, leaving a kind of quiet emptiness in the air. For the pianist, Arthur, it was a familiar feeling. It was the signal that another part of his shift was done. He let his hands drop into his lap for a moment, the muscles in his fingers relaxing. The whole performance was a routine, like brushing his teeth. He played, people occasionally noticed, and then he prepared to play again. He reached for the glass of water on the small table beside him. The ice had mostly melted. He took a slow sip, the cool water feeling good. He used this short break to glance around the store. He saw people walking, talking softly, completely absorbed in their own worlds. He was just part of the scenery, a human machine making pleasant sounds. He was about to decide what to play next, maybe a little Debussy, when he felt a small, gentle pull on the sleeve of his jacket. He looked down. Standing there was the little boy he had seen watching him earlier. The boy's eyes were wide and earnest, looking up at him with a seriousness that was unusual for a child. The boy's mother was a short distance away, watching them. Arthur felt a tiny flicker of annoyance. This happened sometimes. A kid would get excited by the big shiny piano and want to make some noise. He would have to be the grown-up who politely said no, or who let them tap a key or two before guiding them away. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said. His voice was soft but clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the store. "Can I play?" Arthur gave him the standard, gentle smile he reserved for these situations. It was the smile that said, "You're cute, but this is not a toy." He was sure he knew exactly how this would go. The boy would climb up, smash his hands onto the keyboard, creating a loud, jarring crash. He would laugh, and then Arthur would have to gently stop him and help him down. It was a minor interruption to his day. He looked over at the boy's mother again. She wasn't rushing over to pull her son away. She wasn't looking embarrassed. Instead, she had a calm, almost expectant look on her face. She gave a small, reassuring nod as if to say it was okay. This was a little surprising to Arthur. Most parents would be apologizing by now. Thinking this would be quicker if he just went along with it, Arthur decided to be agreeable. "Just for a minute, son," he said, his voice kind but dripping with condescension. He didn't even know the boy's name. He gestured towards the magnificent keyboard, its row upon row of black and white keys looking especially vast and complicated. "You can try it out," he said, as if offering a treat. "But be very careful, all right?" He leaned in a little, lowering his voice to sound serious. "It's a very expensive instrument." He shifted his weight on the long, padded bench, making a small space next to him. He expected the boy to scramble up immediately, his little fingers ready to pound. He was mentally preparing his "okay, that's enough now" speech, ready to deliver it with a patient smile. The boy, however, did not scramble. He placed his small hands on the bench and carefully hoisted himself up. The bench was so high that when he sat, his legs stuck straight out, his feet dangling high above the polished brass pedals on the floor. He swung his feet slightly, a small sign of the child he was. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the keyboard in front of him. It was a beautiful, intimidating thing. Arthur watched, waiting. The pause was longer than he expected. The boy wasn't looking at the piano like it was a noisy toy. He was studying it, his head tilted, his eyes moving across the keys as if he was reading a map. Then the boy did something that made Arthur's professional eye narrow just a little. He took a deep breath. It wasn't a nervous gasp. It was the kind of deep, calming breath a singer takes before a difficult phrase, or a speaker takes before addressing a crowd. It was a breath of focus. He straightened his back, lifting his small shoulders. He raised his hands, holding them just over the keys, his fingers curved naturally, perfectly, like a real pianist's. A small, quiet thought whispered in the back of Arthur's mind. "That's good form." Then the boy placed his hands on the keys. The sight was striking. His dark skin looked beautiful against the pale ivory. His hands were so small. Arthur couldn't imagine how they could possibly span an octave. The first sound came. It was a single note pressed softly. It hung in the air, pure and clear. Then another note and another. They were simple, searching, like someone trying to find a path in the dark. They weren't random. They were connected. They were the beginnings of a melody. Arthur's plan to stop the noise was put on hold. This wasn't noise. He stayed where he was, his body leaning back slightly, his arms crossed. He was curious now. This was different. The boy's eyes closed. His face, which had been so serious, softened. He was no longer looking at the keys or the store or the man beside him. He was listening to something inside himself. His eyebrows furrowed in deep concentration. His whole world had shrunk to the space between his mind, his heart, and his fingers. And then the searching notes found their home. The simple melody suddenly bloomed into something rich and complex. It was a chord, full and warm, that seemed to vibrate right through the piano bench. Then another. The boy's left hand settled into a rhythm, a cool walking pattern that gave the music a solid foundation. It was a jazz rhythm, something Arthur recognized but hadn't played himself in years. His right hand began to dance. The notes poured out now, no longer tentative but confident and fluid. They twisted and turned in unexpected ways, creating a melody that was both happy and a little sad, full of soul. It sounded like a story about a long memory or a hopeful dream. The music had the feeling of a church gospel, something deep and spiritual, mixed with the clever, playful energy of jazz. Arthur felt the polite, slightly bored smile completely vanish from his face. His arms uncrossed and fell to his sides. He was no longer leaning back. He was leaning forward, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape. He was a trained musician. He had spent decades of his life practicing scales, studying theory and learning from masters. He knew better than anyone in that building just how difficult this was. The coordination between the hands, the rhythm, the feeling. This wasn't a child imitating music. This was a musician making music. He watched the boy's hands. They were a blur. They flew across the keyboard, those small fingers stretching to find chords that should have been impossible for them. He wasn't just hitting the right notes. He was putting his soul into them. He would press some notes with a powerful strength that made the piano ring out, and then he would caress others so softly, they were like whispers. He understood dynamics. He understood phrasing. He understood something that can't really be taught: how to make an instrument sing with a human voice. The quiet background noise of the department store had completely stopped. The gentle murmur of conversations was gone. The rustle of shopping bags had ceased. The soft footsteps on the carpet were no more. One by one, every person in the vicinity had frozen. A woman holding a silk scarf let it drop back onto the counter, forgotten. A man who had been on his phone slowly lowered it, his conversation suddenly unimportant. They all turned. Their eyes were drawn to the small boy on the giant bench, and the look of pure, unvarnished shock on the face of the adult pianist standing behind him. A crowd began to form, a silent, slowly gathering circle around the piano. No one spoke. No one wanted to break the spell. They just watched, their faces filled with amazement and wonder. A few people pulled out their phones not to make a call but to record this unbelievable moment. They knew they were witnessing a small miracle. The boy's mother watched, her hand pressed over her heart. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling a radiant, proud smile. She had always known about the music inside her son. She had heard it late at night on the small electronic keyboard in their living room. But to see him here on this grand stage, sharing his gift so freely and watching a professional musician be humbled by it, it was a feeling too big for words. The little boy, completely lost in his own world, played on. The beautiful, complicated, and joyful music filled every corner of the store. He was no longer just a boy who had asked a simple question. He had transformed into an artist, and for these few minutes he held the entire store captive, speaking a language everyone understood, a language made of rhythm, melody, and pure, undeniable soul. The music that came from the piano was not what anyone expected. It was not the clumsy banging of a child. From the very first note, it was different. The sound was searching, thoughtful. The boy's small fingers, which seemed too tiny for such a big instrument, pressed the keys with a delicate purpose. He wasn't making noise. He was asking a question with the piano. The notes hung in the air, soft and clear, like drops of water. The pianist, Arthur, who had been ready for a loud crash, felt his professional ear perk up. The simple melody the boy was exploring was actually in tune. It had a shape to it. He uncrossed his arms, his mild annoyance replaced by a flicker of curiosity. He stayed quiet, watching. Then the boy closed his eyes. His whole body stilled except for his hands. It was as if he had shut out the entire world, the bright lights, the watching people, the tall man beside him. He was listening to a song that was playing only inside his own head, and then the song found its voice. The simple notes melted away and a new sound burst forth. It was a wave of rich, beautiful music that seemed to swell and fill the entire atrium. The boy's left hand dropped into a cool, walking rhythm, a steady pulse that made people's heads nod almost without them realizing it. His right hand began to dance, flying over the higher keys, spinning a melody that was both joyful and deeply soulful. It was the kind of music you might hear in a church full of feeling and spirit, but it also had the clever, unexpected twists of jazz. Arthur's mouth fell open. The polite, slightly bored expression he always wore was completely wiped from his face. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. This was not just a child playing well. This was something else entirely. This was a level of talent he had only seen in concert halls. He was a trained musician. He had dedicated his life to this instrument. He knew the years of practice, the struggle, the discipline it took to make music that could make people stop and feel something. And here was this small boy, his feet not even reaching the pedals, creating this magic as easily as breathing. He watched the boy's hands, mesmerized. They moved with a speed and confidence that defied their size. They formed complex chords, they ran up and down the scales, they made the piano sing, cry, and shout with joy. The boy wasn't just playing notes from a page. He was improvising, creating the music on the spot, pouring his own emotions directly into the instrument. A profound silence had fallen over the department store. The gentle background hum of conversation and movement had completely ceased. The music was so powerful, so commanding that it demanded absolute attention. A woman who had been examining a porcelain vase carefully set it down and turned, her hand moving to her heart. A man who was leading his 2 children by the hand stopped and crouched down, whispering, "Listen to that." The children, who were usually restless, stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the little boy. A store clerk who was in the middle of folding a sweater simply stopped and let the garment rest in her hands, her head tilted as she listened. Slowly, quietly, a crowd gathered. They formed a wide, respectful circle around the grand piano. No one spoke. No one whispered. There was no need for words. The music was saying everything. Faces that moments before had been bored or busy were now filled with wonder. Some people smiled. Others had tears in their eyes, moved by the beauty and the sheer unexpectedness of it all. A few people pulled out their mobile phones, holding them up to record the scene. But they did it quietly, reverently, not wanting to interrupt the moment. They knew they were witnessing something special, something they would want to tell their friends about, something they would want to watch again. Through it all, the boy's mother watched. She stood a little apart from the crowd, her vision blurred by happy tears. She watched the way her son's body swayed gently with the rhythm of his own making. She saw the look of stunned amazement on the faces of the crowd. And she saw the tall pianist who now looked not like a bored employee, but like a man who had just seen a miracle. Her heart swelled with a pride so immense it was almost painful. She remembered the small second-hand keyboard in their apartment. She remembered the way he would sit for hours, not just playing but listening and feeling, teaching himself the sounds that brought him joy.
She had always known he had a gift.
But to see that gift touch so many people, to see it stop a busy store in its tracks was a feeling beyond description. The boy, Leo, was in another world. He was unaware of the crowd, the phones, the tears. He was lost in the conversation between his heart, his mind, and the piano. His face showed the emotion of the music. A small smile during a cheerful run of notes, a serious concentration during a complex chord change. He was not performing for an audience. He was simply sharing the music that lived inside him. Arthur the pianist could only stare. The thoughts racing through his head were a jumble of professional admiration and personal humility. How is this possible? Who taught him this rhythm? It's so advanced. The feeling, you can't teach that. He looked from the boy's flying fingers to his serene, focused face. This was a raw, natural talent. It was a gift, pure and simple. All of Arthur's own training, all his years of experience felt small in that moment. He wasn't feeling jealous. He was feeling awe. This was a reminder of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the job, but for the magic the music built to a powerful climax. The chords becoming richer and louder, filling every corner of the space. And then, with a final, flourishing run up the keyboard, the boy brought the piece to a close. His hands lifted from the keys and settled gently into his lap. The last note echoed softly into a silence that was deeper than before. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. No one made a sound. The spell was still holding everyone captive. And then the silence broke. It started with a single person clapping, then another. And then, the entire circle of people erupted into the loudest, most genuine, most thunderous applause that had ever echoed through that fancy department store. It was not the polite, scattered clapping from before. This was a wave of joy and amazement, a roaring approval for the incredible thing they had just witnessed. People were whistling. They were cheering. They were smiling from ear to ear. The loud sound seemed to startle the boy back to reality. His eyes fluttered open. He looked around, seeming to see the crowd for the first time. A shy, slightly surprised smile touched his lips. He looked small and vulnerable again, sitting on the huge bench. He turned his head and looked up at the tall pianist standing over him. Arthur was still staring, his mind trying to catch up with what his ears had heard and his eyes had seen. The roar of the applause finally broke through his daze. He looked down at the little boy who was gazing up at him with those big, questioning eyes as if to ask, "Was that okay?" Without a second thought, Arthur, the professional pianist, knelt down. He got down on one knee right there on the carpet, so that his face was level with the boy's. He put a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with emotion. It was a whisper, but it was filled with so much respect that it was more powerful than a shout. He began, shaking his head, unable to find a word big enough. That was incredible. Emma, Jamal, etc. The sound that filled the air was not like anything usually heard in the quiet, fancy store. It wasn't the gentle, polite clapping that usually followed the pianist's pieces. This was a wave of noise. It was loud, thunderous applause mixed with cheers and whistles. It was the sound of pure joy and amazement, bursting out from a crowd of people who had just shared a magical moment together. The little boy on the piano bench seemed to jump a little at the sudden noise. His eyes, which had been closed in concentration just seconds before, flew open. He looked around, truly seeing the circle of people for the first time. Dozens of faces were looking right at him, all of them smiling, all of them clapping for him. For a second he looked confused, as if he wasn't sure what all the fuss was about. He had just been playing the piano. Then a slow, shy smile spread across his face. He ducked his head down, a little embarrassed by all the attention, but you could see the happiness in his eyes. He turned on the bench, his small legs still dangling, and looked up at the tall man standing behind him. The pianist, Arthur, was pulled from his stunned silence by the roar of the crowd. The sound was like a blanket wrapping around both him and the boy. He blinked, looking at the cheering people, then his gaze dropped back down to the child. The boy was looking at him with a quiet question in his eyes, as if seeking his approval more than anyone else's in the room. In that moment, something inside Arthur shifted. All the rules and formalities of his job melted away. He wasn't thinking about being a professional musician or a store employee. He was simply a man humbled by an incredible talent. Without a second thought, he moved. He stepped forward and then he knelt. He went down on one knee right there on the plush carpet, so that his face was on the same level as the boy's. It was a gesture of deep respect. He put a gentle hand on the boy's small shoulder. The crowd, seeing this, cheered even louder. The sight of the tall, well-dressed pianist kneeling before the small boy was powerfully moving. Arthur looked directly into the boy's eyes. His own eyes were shining with emotion. When he spoke, his voice was low and a little shaky, filled with a feeling that was hard to describe. He began, and then he stopped, shaking his head as if he couldn't find the right word. That was incredible. The word felt too small, but it was all he had. Who taught you to play like that? The boy looked at him, his shy smile returning. He gave a small, simple shrug of his shoulders. I just listen, he said softly, his voice barely a whisper against the fading applause. And I feel it. Those 5 words hit Arthur with more force than any complex music theory ever could. I just listen and I feel it. This wasn't about lessons or expensive teachers. This was about a pure, natural connection to music. This was a gift straight from the heart. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his life reading notes from a page, trying to capture the feeling the composer intended. This boy didn't need pages. He had the feeling right inside him. Just then, the boy's mother reached them. She moved through the crowd, her face wet with tears, but she was beaming with a pride that lit up her whole face. She didn't say anything to the crowd or to Arthur. She went straight to her son, wrapping her arms around him in a tight, loving hug. She kissed the top of his head, holding him close as if he was the most precious thing in the world. Arthur stood up, taking a step back to give them their moment. He watched the mother and son, understanding now where the boy got his quiet confidence from. She had known. She had believed in him enough to let him ask his simple, brave question. The crowd began to slowly disperse, the magic of the moment settling into a warm, buzzing feeling throughout the store. People were still talking excitedly in low voices, glancing back at the boy with smiles. A few came up to the mother, patting her gently on the arm and saying, "What a talented son you have," or "That was just beautiful." She nodded, thanking them, her arm still tightly around her boy. Arthur just stood there, watching them, his mind racing. He looked at the grand piano, which now seemed different somehow. It wasn't just a piece of furniture for background music anymore. It had been a vessel for something real and powerful. He thought about his own music, the Chopin and the Debussy he played day after day. It was beautiful, but it was someone else's beauty. The music the boy played was entirely his own. He realized that this small child in just a few minutes had taught him more about music than he had learned in years. He had been reminded that at its core, music isn't about perfection or technique. It's about connection. It's about speaking from the soul in a language that everyone can understand. The boy's music had connected with every single person in that store, from the children to the adults, in a way his own polished performances never had. The mother finally turned to him, her son's hand held securely in hers. "Thank you," she said to Arthur, her voice warm and sincere. "Thank you for letting him play." Arthur shook his head, a genuine, humble smile finally breaking through his look of shock. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Thank you. Thank you for sharing him." He looked down at the boy. "You have a very special gift, young man. Don't ever stop playing. Don't ever stop sharing that feeling." The boy looked up at him and nodded. A serious look on his small face, with a final, grateful smile from the mother. They turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the aisles of the store, the boy glancing back once at the piano. Arthur was left alone by the instrument. The store was slowly returning to its normal rhythm, but the air was still charged with the memory of what had happened. He sat down slowly on the piano bench, the spot where the boy had sat still warm. He placed his own hands on the keys, but he didn't play. He just sat there in the quiet, feeling the profound silence that the boy's music had left behind. A silence that was more powerful than any sound. Emma, Jamal, etc. The mother and her son walked away, their figures getting smaller as they moved through the aisles of perfumes and shiny handbags. The little boy glanced back just once, his eyes finding the big black piano one last time before he disappeared from view. The crowd that had gathered was now gone, the people returning to their shopping, but their faces were different. They looked brighter, happier, as if they had all shared a wonderful secret. Arthur, the pianist, was left alone by the instrument. He slowly lowered himself onto the piano bench. The spot where the boy had been sitting was still warm. He placed his own hands on the keys, his long fingers resting on the cool, smooth ivory. But he did not play. He just sat there completely still in the deep quiet that had settled over the store. It was a different kind of quiet than before. The quiet from earlier was just an absence of noise, a blank space waiting to be filled. This new quiet was full. It was filled with the echo of the music that had just been there. He could almost still hear it, the soulful melody, the walking rhythm, the powerful chords. The silence itself seemed to be humming. He looked down at his own hands. For so many years, these hands had been his tools. They had practiced for thousands of hours. They had learned to read complex musical languages written on paper. They could recreate the great works of famous composers with skill and precision. He was a craftsman and he was good at his craft. But the boy's hands, they were not just tools. They were a direct connection to his heart. He wasn't recreating something. He was creating something new right in that moment. He wasn't playing notes. He was speaking a language of emotion that everyone could feel. Arthur realized that in all his years of training, he had been focusing on the how of music, how to play the notes, how to follow the dynamics. The little boy understood the why. The why was to make people feel something. A store manager walked over, his shoes making no sound on the carpet. "That was quite something," the manager said softly, a look of wonder still on his face. "I've never seen anything like it in here." Arthur just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The manager patted him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving him with his thoughts. Arthur thought about the boy's simple answer. "I just listen and I feel it." It sounded so easy. But that was the hardest part of all. To really feel the music, to be so open and brave that you could pour your feelings out for everyone to hear. That was a courage that many musicians, including himself, often lost along the way. They got caught up in getting it right and not making a mistake. The boy didn't care about mistakes. He only cared about the music. He thought about the mother's face, wet with tears of pride. She hadn't been pushing her son to perform. She had simply believed in him enough to let him try. She had created a space where his gift could grow, not in a practice room but in the living room of their home, on a small, second-hand keyboard. She saw the music in him before anyone else did. The rest of Arthur's shift passed in a blur. He played his usual pieces, a little Mozart, a little Beethoven. The music was still beautiful, but to him it now felt distant, like he was telling someone else's story. His heart wasn't in it. His heart was still back in that moment of stunned silence, watching the small boy bring the piano to life. When his time was up, he packed his sheet music away and closed the lid over the piano keys. The act felt more final than usual. He said goodnight to the security guard and stepped out of the store into the cool evening air. The city was loud with traffic and people, a stark contrast to the quiet world inside the store. But as he walked to the bus stop, the city noises seemed to fade into the background. In his mind, he could still hear the boy's song. It played on a loop, the joyful runs, the soulful chords. It was more than just a melody. It was a feeling. It was a reminder. He thought about his own love for music, a love that had started when he was not much older than the boy. He remembered the excitement of discovering a new chord, the joy of making a song his own. Somewhere between music school and getting a job, that raw joy had gotten a little buried under routine. It had become a job. The boy had dug it up again. The next day, when Arthur returned to the store for his shift, things were different. He walked to the grand piano with a new feeling. He opened the lid and arranged his music, but he also left a little space in his mind for something else. He began to play his scheduled piece, but in the middle of it he did something he hadn't done in years. He improvised. He took the composer's melody and he played with it, adding a little run of his own, changing the rhythm just slightly, putting a piece of his own feeling into it. It was a small thing, but for him it was a revolution. He looked at the shoppers not as a background, but as an audience. He played to connect with them, not just to fill the silence. He watched their faces, and when he saw someone smile or nod along, he felt a little spark of the joy he had seen on the boy's face. The story of the little boy at the piano did not end that day. The people who were there told their friends and families. The videos they had taken were shared, spreading the small moment of magic far beyond the walls of the department store. For many who saw it, it was a story about a prodigy, a child with an amazing gift. But for Arthur, the story was about something more. It was a lesson in humility. It was a reminder that true talent can appear in the most unexpected places, wearing the smallest shoes. It was a wake-up call to remember the soul of music, the feeling that gives it life. He never saw the boy or his mother again. They were a single brilliant moment in time, but their presence lingered in the air around the piano. Sometimes, when the store was quiet, Arthur would remember the shy question, "Can I play?" And he would smile. The boy had left something behind that was more valuable than any amount of applause. He had left a reminder that music is not a competition or a mere performance. It is a gift, meant to be shared from one heart to another. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the quietest voices and the smallest hands.